And action! Hey everyone, it's DrRic. Saira had a question about concussions. And I did do a video before. I'll try to put a link down below. If this is the first time you're finding me, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below and the alert button. And because it's football season now, August, September, please pass this on to any parents that might be going through, or students, athletes that might be going through the same thing. So concussions. Let's just break it down into something practical. There isn't anything that's spectacularly going to speed up resolution. What we have to figure out is maybe how to avoid it, what to watch out for when you have it. There are a couple of things you might be able to clear that will be confusing to the doctor or the athletic trainer trying to get you back in, so maybe we can speed up a couple of those things. So what happens with concussion? Well, when you have, this is a head and this is a brain. And the brain sits in this skull, like this coconut, which is full of fluid. Actually, I can't hear anything, but it's full of fluid. This is full of fluid because it acts as a barrier for this little brain. It moves a little bit, but the fluid is supposed to protect it from when you get hit or you had sudden jarring effects. The fluid works almost like a shock absorber in a car. It dampens the shock of the potholes, so you don't feel anything and you drive smooth. Same thing with the head. The problem is if there's an overwhelming force, a big enough pothole for your car, you will feel something. And if the force is hit this way, like a headbutt, or a boxing match, or a helmet-to-helmet collision, or a diving board to a diver's head collision, you will have the trauma to the part of the skull that's taking the impact. And then when that moves back a little bit, with a fast enough speed, the brain won't have enough time to react in that cushion of fluid, and it'll get hit in the front. It'll get slapped. Brain tissue does not like to get slapped. Brain tissue does not like to get messed around with. Just people, and the nerve is brain tissue. So people who type like this all day long, they choke off the carpal tunnel, the median nerve, and the median nerve tells you, I don't like what you did to me, so I'm going to give you numbness, tingling, and problems with strength all night long. Imagine if you have that with just this kind of thing all day, while getting hit by full force 250-pound football helmet coming your way, or a fist. There's going to be a lot of force. You'll have a bruise, and then what will happen is the head will stop, and the brain will continue going, and it'll stop too, or it'll get stopped back here, and that's that thing called contre-coup. You'll have a coup, contre-coup, damaged bruise to the front and the back of the brain. And that bruise, when it happens, will cause bleeding. Bleeding when you have it to an elbow, not a big deal, right? Because you got a lot of room. It hurts when you touch it. It might hurt when you move it. That's not a big deal. It looks black and blue. When you have that to a brain that doesn't have any room to expand or swell up, or when the brain is very detailed with its involvement in electrical impulse, you can't have swelling because it screws up the electrical impulse and it screws up the function of the brain. So what does it happen? What do you experience? Headaches. You can't think. That part of the brain that gets hit, like the frontal part, you won't be able to have problem processing, thinking. You won't be able to pull out your ideas from before. You'll have memory issues. If you have a contre-coup injury back here, you'll have problems with vision because this occipital lobe is responsible for vision. So the side lobes are responsible for emotion, so there's different parts of the brain that are responsible for different functions. Depending on where you get hit, even if you get hit like this and you get hit on the top, you'll have what we think, those doctors think, or associate with the functions of that part of the brain. So that, you don't have to go into the details about that, but just as long as you know coup, contre coup, and that's the basic mechanism or setup. In the case of a soccer head-to-head, both people are going to get bruised to the front. And so this is how we figure it out. Most high schools in Illinois have athletic trainers. An athletic trainer is supposed to be on the field for most major events. Usually collision sports or contact sports, football. But soccer is one, so sometimes we'll have the coaches keep eyes on when there's not an athletic trainer around. Track and field, volleyball, you don't really have trainers around, but coaches, again, can take the place. So in collision sports or contact sports, there has to be a physician somewhere on the field, like not for practice, but for games. I'm with Bartlett High School. One of us is supposed to be on the field watching out for emergency. It's usually going to be just in case there is a major collapse, so that before 911 gets there, which is probably response time of 5 to 10 minutes, we could administer first aid. And it makes a difference. So the idea again with minor injuries in non-contact sports, and soccer theoretically is not really a contact sport, but there's a nice study with FIFA players who have played more than 10 years. This is from about 15 years ago. They looked at the occurrence of concussions and post-traumatic or post-sport injury and problems with Parkinsonian type symptoms afterward, and they found there was a direct association with the number of years you played. Back then, they used to use leather balls, and they'd play even in the rain, and a wet leather ball, when you're taking a header, is much heavier than the new elastics that are the new fabrics that they have now. So it can happen even in non-contact, non-collision sports. Hockey, obviously, that's a big collision sports. You'll see a lot of damage. So here's the bottom line when we have a concussion. Coach is supposed to observe. I like Dr. Robert Cantu out of Boston's or Massachusetts. He had the Cantu's staging of different, it's essentially 3. And you can break down the concussions to essentially minor symptoms: headache, nausea, vomiting, blurred vision, and then there's that with amnesia, and there's a time frame for that, and then there's all those with a loss of consciousness. When you have loss of consciousness, that's it. I like to follow. In fact, there is a new release of the Association of Ringside Physicians suggestions on what to do with students or athletes in combat sports. I'm with Ringside Physicians. Took care of a couple of events downtown Chicago in the last 10 to 15 years. And we have a protocol for when I have to run into the ring and or take care of a fighter that goes down. So usually that's obvious. When somebody gets knocked out, they're out, and they're usually out of competition with the new guidelines for 30 to 90 days. But if there's no loss of consciousness, no knockout, just a technical knockout, I probably shouldn't talk about that, it gets a little bit detailed. If there's no loss of consciousness, then you just have somebody that has a little bit of a headache, nausea, vomiting afterward. That's still concussion, but it's considered mild. Remember Cantu's suggestions, mild. If it's mild concussion, no loss of consciousness, no amnesia, like with my soccer player, Saira, then we're safe. But you don't necessarily have to see me. Usually, again, I like combat sports sets the standard. I like their standard, and if somebody has symptoms past 10 days, they really should see a doctor trained in concussion. Not a regular doctor, because they might not be able to clear you, number 1, with sports medicine, number 2, with concussion. But if you're within that window, you just had the injury, the event, you still have a little bit of symptom here and there, well, the easiest thing to do is hold off from sports. If you're questioning whether you can hold off in sports, then you can come in and see your doctor. If you see somebody that's not trained in concussion, then they'll probably tell you, go back in a week, start training again. And there's an algorithm for that. Again, by the American Association of Ringside Physicians, we do have a hierarchy of what to do. So here's how it goes. This is how I apply it to my athletes. Any athlete that suffers an injury, even a cyclist that falls off and has a concussion. I remember I was in the ER once. I had an off-road cyclist, that mountain biker, who fell off and hit his head with a helmet on a rock. And he was going down an embankment, and he split his helmet. Thank God he was wearing a helmet, but by the way, when you crack the helmet or when you've dented it, that helmet is done. You have to replace it. Even if it looks good and the foam is still intact, you still have, that's it. So the way it works with the practical guidelines that I'm going to give you are, the first thing we want to do is return you back into exercise. A light aerobic, then moderate aerobic, then strenuous aerobic. And if we can tolerate that, cool. Usually we can advance you every 24 hours. You got to try it, see how you do. And I'm talking about light aerobic being like bicycle or a little bit of treadmill. And the treadmill I don't like because you have the jarring effect. Bicycle's a little easier, or the elliptical perhaps. And you try that. If you succeed with no pain and the trainer or coach is watching you and you're not dogging it and you're not hiding anything, then we will watch you for 24 hours. If you're okay 24 hours, then we move you to more moderate activity. And the moderate activity in combat sports would be mitt use, jumping rope, a little bit of light sparring. No, actually, I shouldn't say that. Just keep it at more aggressive aerobic capacity exercise, since we're talking about just applying those same concepts to regular sports. After you get to tolerate that for 24 hours, no exacerbation of headache after that, or nausea, vomiting, blurred vision, any of that stuff, then you go on to more strenuous forms of exercise. And that might be more sports specific to your sport, whether it's volleyball, soccer. And if you can tolerate drills that way, then you're okay for sport specific training. And that's how we move the hierarchy up as far as combat sports, and I think you can apply that to regular sports. Again, if you're unsure, or if you can't even pass 24 hours, or if you can't even pass 5 minutes with light aerobic capacity exercise, there's something wrong. You cannot progress on. The old way would be, again, if there's no loss of consciousness involved, and that's very strict. When you have loss of consciousness, it's going to be abstaining from your sport and even training for 30 to 90 days. And sometimes a CT or MRI is important, depends on the symptoms. But if there's no loss of consciousness, and for making it easy, no amnesia, just having mild symptoms, then this is where we kind of have this gray zone. And the guidelines are set, whether it's Can2's guidelines or the Association of Ringside Physicians guidelines. They're just guidelines, and people fall below and above the guidelines, so it's up to the doctor to kind of figure it out. But if your doctor isn't trained or hasn't been to ringside, doesn't know anything about concussion, and most doctors know in medical school what to do with concussion, but nowadays with all the sports, the pushing of athletes, the younger athletes getting into more daring events, I think it's important to go to somebody that's trained with concussion. So if you can't and you have no choice, then go see your doctor, but hopefully they at least look it up or consult one of us. So what we do is progress on. And I gave you the timetable. So I would usually say if the physical exam in the office is okay, say you're coming to see me, and everything at home is okay, you're eating, you're going through, and everything at school is okay, and everything at sleep is okay, then that's a pretty good recovery. It might not be a concussion, it might be a light headache. If that's the case, we'll get you back to sports real quick. The easiest thing to do, because most sporting events happen on weekends, is to hold off from training for about 3 to 5 days, and then test the athlete out again a couple of days before the next weekend and see how things go. I think the best thing you can do, and here's where I guess you can speed things up. I mentioned when I first started the video, there isn't really anything you can do to compress the time frame of concussions. I meant as far as taking drugs, or as far as a hyperbaric chamber, or as far as taking really weird supplements. I don't think there's enough justification or studies, randomized controlled trials, to say that anything speeds anything up. You'll hear about crazy things on the internet, but don't believe them, please. What I think would help me and you get you back to sports would be to take care of all the other things that usually cause headache. And it's now, again, August, September. So what happens in August and September? Allergies. So even if you don't have big problems and just a little itchy eye or a little stuffy nose, hey, when you have a concussion and you come back in for an evaluation and you have a stuffy nose that flared up that day, even if you were great for 5 days, this is going to have to be mistaken for, well, that might not be a stuffy nose. The facial stuffiness and the blurred vision could actually be from a concussion, so you're out for another week. So I usually say if it's allergy season, or if you're even slightly allergic during the season that you're being evaluated, get the nose clear. Use nasal saline. I'll put a link down below to how to deal with a stuffy nose. Use over-the-counter nasal sprays. I like nasal crom. I don't like the steroids all the time. Nasal crom is over the counter. I think I have it in my video. You can use things like butterbur or quercetin or stinging nettles. Or sometimes you can get under your Zyrtec and your Allegra and your Claritin. Even if you're not having bad symptoms, I'd still consider going through that. And there's no harm in using those things for allergies when you have a concussion. There is harm in using Advil, Aleve, ibuprofen, naproxen, any anti-inflammatory. In fact, the only medicine, pain-wise, that you can take without asking a doctor is Tylenol. Tylenol won't screw up your bleeding problem. Remember, when I said you get a bruise, you'll have bleeding, microscopic bleeding, not a big gusher, but it's microscopic, and when there's enough microscopic hits to the brain, it'll really cause swelling, and it'll slow down your healing process. So when you take things like alcohol or blood thinners or anti-inflammatories like I mentioned, all the anti-inflammatories are called NSAIDs, and I have a video on NSAIDs, I'll put that link there too. You're going to increase the potential for bleeding. Even though it helps with headaches and fever, it's going to make you bleed and make the concussion last longer, or it can possibly kill you because of continued bleeding. So I'd say avoid all that stuff. Avoid any supplements that cause bleeding. If you're not sure, then you just stop them all. I think you can stop your supplements for about a week if you're unsure. It's argued that fish oil and turmeric can sometimes make bleeding occur more, but I think you can hold off on those things for the time being. Don't hold off on your medicines unless you ask your doctor. So you can avoid that. You can take care of the nose in case it is an issue. If you usually wear tight headbands, if you wear tight caps, if you have to wear a helmet at work or your volunteer job, try to avoid that, because any kind of excessive pressure, even if your equipment and your headband didn't cause a problem before, it can cause a problem now, and then I'm going to see you, I'm going to think, well, is it the headband or is it your concussion? I don't care. It's a concussion. 1 more week off. So I would say try to avoid anything. Even a tight ponytail can sometimes do it. Even laying on a tight ponytail or a bun can do it. So please avoid that stuff. Obviously, avoiding excessive amounts of stress. Stress in the form of arguments, breaking up with a boyfriend or a loved one, going through exams. Final exams can also, because you're asking them or their frontal brain to calculate, pull out all the memories from before and problem solve. That can be a problem. I can sometimes get you a note for that. Avoiding excessive amounts of stress from nutrition. If you have crappy food, don't do the crappy food when you're trying to heal up. What happens when you have an athlete that's trying to heal up and he's eating crappy? He's going to heal crappy, and it's going to cause prolonged healing, and you'll be out for longer. So eat right. That's a whole food, mostly plant-based diet. Eating processed food, eating meat, eating dairy, no. And that, I would say, avoid dairy. You can have almond milk, soy, cashew, flax, rice, but try to avoid cow. I don't like cow. I don't like yogurt, unless you can find yogurt that's non-dairy. I just think it's an irritant, so try to avoid it. So avoiding stress, avoiding nasty foods, that you should be avoiding anyway. Avoiding poor sleep. So when you try to skimp on hours, I know most people can get by and just have a Starbucks in the morning. You're not allowing the healing time to occur, so you really need to dive into sleep. You might not be ready for it. You might just wake up early morning anyway, but I still say try to embrace a little more sleep, relaxation practice. And that goes back to the stress thing. And physical activity. So impact exercise can cause the headache to come on again. So this is a coup contra coup, but if you're going on the treadmill like I mentioned before, or you're skipping rope, or you're doing chores and you're swinging a hammer that has to take impact and send it through your body, those things are bad. If you can avoid that, it'd be good. If you can avoid exercise, if you can avoid increasing your pulse rate, increasing your blood pressure, that would be good too, because again, if you increase your pulse and blood pressure, it forces blood vessels to dilate and force fluid into areas, and that's already delicate. So you don't want to be doing that. That's why I hold off from any exercise, including gym class. In fact, sometimes even taking the steps, where that's probably pushing it a little bit too much, where I have people just taking it easy, having a book buddy, using the school elevator, and being allowed to get out of class early, and being allowed a couple of minutes being late into class. So it just calms the stress response and takes another variable away. So you will hopefully, if you take care of all those excessive stressors, it'll speed up the healing process. If you take away any coexisting problems. Old trigger points to trapezius work. If you're doing a lot of book bag carrying and you notice that you have trap work or trap spasm typically, you don't want that to exist now, because that'll throw headaches in and be another trigger to have the headache continue on. So double the shoulder straps, or pull your book bag. Or have somebody else carry your books, the book buddy note for using the elevator pass thing. So if you do all that stuff, and by all means, I know I had a couple of students that came in and said they answered all the questions correctly. They knew what I was going to ask them, and said, I don't have this, I don't have this, I don't have this. And it sounded okay, it just sounded like somebody was faking something. So what I do, I called up the trainer and said, let's put him through figure eights, lateral exercises, sprints, easy, and he didn't pass. Or the ones that I thought that were malingering didn't pass. And I love athletes, because they really want to get back in the sport. I have to hold an athlete back. In workman's comp, I got to push the worker to go back to work, so it's totally different. But again, I sometimes I'm looked at as the bad guy because I'm holding off from sports. And sometimes if I have a running back or a star athlete that I don't allow back into the game, it could cause a lose. And that's not going to be looked upon. But hey, listen, second impact happens in the United States. If you're the one that happens to get the second impact syndrome is when you die. Because after getting your first bruise, if you have another bruise on top of that, sometimes in this case of second impact syndrome, the brain actually shuts down, collapses, and chokes off. It swells up where it doesn't fit anymore in here, and it chokes itself off, and you stop breathing. So it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen, and that's why, at least in Illinois, we have trainers on the field. We have a protocol when we have contact sports, and definitely collision sports, and we're trying to avoid those kind of things. And now even in Illinois, all the trainers, at least the ones at my high school, have been taught to do pre-sport or pre-season evaluation, so you have a metric before and then a metric possibly after in case there was a problem before. Because learning disabilities, ADD, mood disorders sometimes make an evaluation a little tough. So, Saira, hopefully this helps a bit. If any of you have any questions, post them down below. I'll see if I can get to them. But again, we got to play safe. It's always good to use your talents as best as you can because God gave them to you. So excel, and you might even get a scholarship and a free ride into college. But at the sacrifice of chronic headaches? No. At the sacrifice of migraines? Definitely not. At the sacrifice of death? It's definitely not worth it. So I'd rather have you, whether it's an individual or you're playing for the team, come back 110% and get that kid later. No, I'm just kidding. So again, subscribe down below if you haven't already. Otherwise, stay connected, and I'll see you in the clinic.